I wanted to spend a little time talking with you about the development of gestures. Your book doesn't do a lot of conversation in this area, and gestures is a really, really important developmental behavior that emerges, a foundation of other higher level linguistic skills, and I wanted to spend a little time talking a little bit about it and giving you a little bit more information. When we're talking about gestures, we are talking about an action produced with the intent to communicate, and so that's really key here. This isn't a child just picking up a rattle and rattling it. It's about a motoric behavior that is really completed by the child with the intent to communicate. And if what we know is that gesture, speech, and language are coupled together neurologically and developmentally. And so when we think about where these kinds of foundations lie in terms of brain research, neurologically, we know that they're together. But really an important point here is that even though gestures are closely linked to language development, they're not the same thing as language, and they're not the same thing as sign language. So when we talk about when we talked about what kinds of characteristics constitute a language, we talked about the fact that language has to be symbolic, which gestures can be, that they have to be rule governed, and they have to be have the ability to create different ways of combining them into more meaningful information, more meaningful messages, and that's not the case for gestures. Typically when we think about children using gestures, they're using a single gesture at a time. There are several types of gestures, and it's important for you to be able to understand what each of them are. And the first one is a didactic gesture, and that's used to establish a referent or call attention to an object. And typically one of the most important or common didactic gestures is a point. So when we think about a child pointing to an item, obviously that's used to call attention to that object, but could also be a handout showing an object, could be another kind of didactic gesture. For social gestures, we think about things like gestures that are used to say hi or bye or no, and so you can think about that from a hand perspective, or you can think about that as a head shake. Instrumental are gestures that are used to have an adult enact in a behavior, and so, for example, arms being picked up are an instrumental gesture. Recognitory are kind of quirky ones, and they're quirky because what a recognitory gesture is, and it's also called actions with objects, is just using using objects as they're intended to. So, for example, brushing your hair with a brush, or drinking something from a cup. So those don't really have communicative or symbolic status in the same way, but gesture theorists include recognitory gestures as one of the gestures. And then the last gesture here is representational or symbolic. Those are two words, synonyms for the same thing. And in that, they both establish a referent and have semantic content. Your notes talk about the idea of a child who hands you a bubble wand and makes a blowing sound at the same time. Not only are they establishing attention to the bubbles or the bubble wand, but they're also communicating some information, like they want you to blow bubbles. Another example would be a child who picks up a wind-up toy and gives it to you and makes some movement that would suggest they want you to actually wind up that wind-up toy. So representational gestures have both a referent and a semantic content. And when we think about when gestures develop, we know that at 6 months, children will sometimes do some pointing, but they're not truly gestures at that point. So you might see a baby kind of using their index finger to tap on a page in a book, for example, but at that point they're not communicative. They're not trying to establish a referent or share information. 8 to 14 months is when we see didactic gestures come in, and so we talked about that in class, that what we're looking for as a marker of typical development is that representational point, and we see that really solidly in place at usually about 9, 10, but definitely by 10 to 12 months of age we see that established. At 12 months, we see those social gestures of waving, for example. 15 to 18 months, instrumental, and then also maybe 12 to 18 months are those symbolic gestures. You don't have to memorize those time frames of when we'd expect that gesture to come in, except with the exception of a point, just because it represents such an important developmental stage for children. And we think about what the relationship of gestures to language development is. We see that it is important for facilitating joint attention. So obviously pointing to an object is one of the most common ways that we might establish joint attention, that a child may do that, facilitating adults' attention to an item. One of the other reasons that we think gesture is so important is that it really ensures children get ample input. So for example, a child who is pointing to things, what's the natural response to that? And the natural response to that is an adult saying, oh yeah, that is a ball. Do you want mama to get the ball? Here's the ball. And so as a child is engaging in behaviors that's facilitating that joint attention and directing an adult's attention and communicating in intentional ways before they actually are producing true words, in a responsive environment, they're going to be getting a lot of verbal input during those times. We also know that gestures draw the caretaker's attention to, their interesting things that are interesting to the child. For example, it helps to augment when communication fails. So we see that using gestural communication can be a way that a child who's not yet talking gets some of their needs met. If they want something that's, maybe on the table and they can't reach it and they point, again, the adult's response is likely to engage with them and potentially allow them access to that item. And so we see that it helps decrease some of those maybe communication breakdowns, for example. And we also know, and this is an important point, that gestures at 16 months predicts vocabulary at 20. So we know children who are doing a lot of gestures is a really good sign for language development. And then the last piece there suggests that gestures fade over time. So all of this sort of ways that kids are augmenting their interactions early on don't continue when they have words. It's not to say they stop using gestures, but they just end up having the same kind of reference point. Here are some examples of some gestures for you to take a look at, some pointing and imitating of an adult's gestures and so on. And so we'll take a look at this a little bit more in class as well, but these would be great resources for you to look at and see if you can identify the gestures when they're happening. When you do your toddler observation report, you're asked to do exactly that, is to take a look at a video clip and analyze what's happening. And you'll see gestural language in there, and so the expectation is that you'll be able to identify that gesture and talk about what kind of gesture it is. That's it. Thank you.